Well, thanks very much for inviting us, and it is great to be in the county that helped to give birth to the Labour movement.
Yay.
We have something in common with Derby. We had an industrial dispute actually that predated the Toll Puddle Martyrs by a few months. It was the silk mill lockout, and it was allegedly one of the first, if not the first, industrial disputes anywhere in the country, if not the world. And so I think our two parts of the country have a lot in common, and of course Derby was as you may or may not know, the first place in England to elect a Labour MP. We elected a bloke called Richard Bell, who was elected in the same election that Keir Hardie was elected, but Keir was able to claim to be the very first Labour MP elected, because the elections in those days were held over 2 days, and the declaration in Merthyr Tydfil was the 24 hours before the one in Derby. And we can still claim to be the first in England, however, because obviously that's in Wales. So anyway, but yeah. So well, no, it's good to be here. I mean, it's great to see the party in rude health in places like Dorset, and what I'm finding all over the country is that there is a huge upsurge in support for the party, a huge interest in joining the Labour Party, and we now have, active constituencies and branches in places where we never previously had a Labour footprint at all. And we're able to put candidates up in areas for local council elections in places where we never were able to field anybody before. And the reception that people are telling me, I don't know whether you're finding it, but when the people are going around and speaking to constituents on the doorstep and so on, they're finding a really receptive audience, and a lot of people saying, it's fantastic to see the Labour Party come. We've never seen anybody from the Labour Party. And so, I think the future bodes well for us, and partly because there's never been an easier time to campaign for the Labour Party. I make this point all over the country. If you actually look at Labour's programme now, it's actually supported by the overwhelming majority of the British public. If you look at bringing the water industry back into public ownership, for example, around 83% of the public want that to happen. It's in the high 70s for bringing the railways back and the gas and the electricity back into public ownership. Similar levels of support for scrapping tuition fees, for investing in council housing, for creating meaningful jobs again, giving young people a future, a stake in society and so on. So it's a great time to be active, I think, in the Labour Party. We're living in historic times, there's no doubt about that, and that's not just about Brexit. I just think the appetite for common sense socialism has never been greater, to be honest with you, and it's not just in this country either. I think there's a real yearning for a socialist alternative all over the world, even in the United States of America. And I was over there in September as part of my Democracy Roadshow, believe it or not. I went sort of stateside and was speaking to the New York branch of Labour International. Labour International were the constituency which kind of represents expats all over the world, but they were the branch constituency, if you like, of the party that had put that motion forward to conference around open selection, about mandatory reselection. So it's great to be there. But what we're seeing, I mean, we saw the kind of upsurge of support for Bernie Sanders. We saw what's her name, Francesca, or is it Antonia Ocasio-Cortez, who was elected actually. What's her first name? Alexandra, that's it. Yeah, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. And she's been elected with an overwhelming majority. But the key thing was winning the primary to be actually selected as the Democrats' candidate, and that's one of the things I think just around about the whole issue of open selections is that every other democracy around the world, as far as I can tell, have open selections, open primaries, because she actually replaced a stalwart, didn't she, of the Democrat Party, and people didn't see it as a democratic outrage that happened. So I think we need to embracing democracy, because it was Tony Benn who said that in order to democratise our society, we need to democratise our party first. So there's a long way to go, and I'll perhaps come back on to talking a bit, if we've got time, around the sort of democracy review. But I was asked to speak a bit about pensions, about the NHS, about housing, in my sort of few remarks this afternoon. And just in relation, you just had a speech from where is she? She's gone. She's still here. Where are you? Are you there, comrade? Yeah, sorry, mate. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I know what you said, but I'm strongly supportive of the campaign, the WASPy campaign, the Back to 60 campaign. I think is something that we should be embracing, I think, as a party. But there's more that we need to do, I think, to create the space to encourage the party to incorporate that commitment into the manifesto. Let's remember, we are the 6th biggest economy in the world. And it's all about political priorities, it seems to me, in the end. It's where our political priorities lie. I mean, for the last 40 years, including under the 13 years of New Labour, sadly, the people who benefited most from the economic model that we adopted after Margaret Thatcher's Tories came into office in 1979 is obviously led to greater inequality and has benefited the faceless corporations and the wealthy elites. We've had socialism for the rich, effectively, haven't we? And we've had corporate scroungers with their hands out for grants from government for things like research and development, whilst we are undermining our social security system, whilst we're expecting people to work longer and longer, whilst we're reneging on, a solemn pledge, I think, that was made in relation to women's pensions. And we need to, I think, ensure that we are providing a social security system, including pensions, which are, fit for purpose, which are commensurate with a economy that is the 6th biggest in the world. And as I say, it's all about political priorities. Because if you think back to 1945, when we came into office with a socialist programme, the first majority Labour government that had ever been elected, coming out of a country that was ravaged by war, where we had a debt to GDP ratio over 250%, and Churchill telling Clem Attlee that the country was broken, we couldn't therefore make any commitments, or he couldn't make any outlandish commitments, because the first priority was to repay the debt. And of course, Clem told him in 1945 parlance to do one. And we built the National Health Service, created the National Health Service, the welfare state, built 1 million new homes, maintained full employment, and created an economic system which stood the test of time for 34 years. Bigger and bigger proportion of the national income every single year, if you look at the graphs, from the late 40s right the way through to, well, really till Thatcherism, to be honest with you. A bigger and bigger proportion went to workers in their wage packets. Inequality was getting narrower and narrower. We got to a place where, working class youngsters were able to aspire to buy their own home. In the teens. I mean, I was able to do that as a 19-year-old apprentice bricklayer, able to buy my own brand new house backing onto a waterfront in a desirable village 8 miles south of Derby, and it was only 3 times what I was earning as an apprentice bricklayer. Me and my girlfriend had saved up for a year. It felt like a lot longer, because obviously that was a much bigger proportion of your life in those days, didn't it? A year now is kind of nothing, but then it felt like a long time. But that kind of thing was doable, and it's kind of impossible now. And so I think it's really important, therefore, that we do, as a party, as a movement, make the case, make the argument, and make those demands for a social security system that's fit for purpose. And that includes having a pension system which is fit for purpose, and the present arrangement isn't fit for purpose. And as I say, it is about political priorities, but we are, as I've already said, an incredibly wealthy country, and irrespective of what happens with Brexit, we will get wealthier, I believe. And we're also in the midst of this technological revolution which is taking place right now, the 4th industrial revolution. And the question is, are we going to secure the fruits of that technological revolution for the many, or are we going to leave it in the hands of the private sector, leave it in the hands of the market to determine who gets the benefits of that technological revolution? And those of you that are of a certain generation will remember how we were told in the 1960s to be ready for the leisure generation in the 1990s or early 2000s, when we're going to be working 15 hours a week. And that's not, or wasn't then, a new idea. John Maynard Keynes predicted in 1930 that we will only by 2030 working around 10 or 15 hours a week. We'll be awash with spare time. And you know, some of the great thinkers over the years, including Karl Marx and others, you know, have made that point. And it's a question really, as I say, about, you know, well, how do we organise ourselves? How do we organise society in a way to ensure that we can have a much reduced working week, how we can have, you know, the fruits of the economy that benefit the majority. And I think, again, going back to that 1945 example, yes, it was true that the country was in huge debt, but by the end of the 1940s, you know, we were in a much better place, actually, economically. We were starting to kind of massively reduce the sovereign debt, and living standards were improving. And I think what it demonstrated was that when you kind of invest in the economy, when you put money in the pockets of ordinary workers, when you have a social security system which is more fit for purpose, which is compassionate, which recognises people's needs instead of demonising people, which is what we're seeing at the moment, that has a beneficial knock-on effect. You're trying to create an economic virtuous circle, because people on modest incomes and middle incomes, when you've got a bit more money, we tend to spend it. When you give the super rich and the faceless corporations a load of brass, they don't spend it. Their wealth pots kind of grow. And it doesn't really benefit the economy. And this sort of notion of trickle-down economics has been totally exploded, in my opinion. It's just simply not worked for the vast majority of people. It's certainly not working economically for us. And so I think we should, you know, be supporting the cause for pension justice as a party, as a membership. We need to be pressing for that, passing resolutions, and I know that Jeremy and John are sympathetic to it, but it's not just a one-way street. I know John and, you know, Jeremy's leader, but he's not got complete freedom to move. It's about there are certain forces of conservatism, as we know, inside the Labour Party, and we need to address that. But if we can, as grassroots party members, you know, create the space and give the support to Jeremy and so on, then that makes it easier, you know, to develop those common sense socialist policies going forward. And you know, that's really why I think, or one of the reasons why Jeremy says, you know, you are the messengers. I mean, and it's really important that we take that message out and we continue to push that. And I think this whole issue around the National Health Service too is so important, but not just the National Health Service. I mean, what we've seen as a result of the model that's been, well, introduced by Thatcher and then embraced by New Labour, was that public services, including the National Health Service, was seen as a cash cow. It was used to generate profits for the private sector. And you know, we've made it very clear that, you know, there is no place for the private sector in delivering the NHS services, and we'll repeal that Health and Social Care Act, and that we will absolutely change that whole dynamic where the private sector are essentially ripping off the NHS, and we therefore need an entirely, you know, nationalised National Health Service. And there's overwhelming support for that across the country, and I think we should be going further though and saying, you know, the private sector's really got no place in delivering any public services, actually. You know, I mean, public service should be entirely around delivering good quality, decent public services for people, not generating private profits. Because what we've seen where public services have been hived off to the private sector is that terms and conditions of workers of delivering those services have been diminished, and very often the quality of the service that's provided is inferior to that that's delivered by the public sector. That's not to say everything's perfect in the public sector, but it's more accountable, and you've got greater opportunities, I think, to correct the errors if and when they do take place. But of course, one of the issues, for example, with the privatisation, the outsourcing of public services, is that the companies that are delivering those public services are no longer subject to, or the services are no longer subject to, the Freedom of Information Act. You can't get any kind of information about what's going on. So, you know, that was a disappointment, I think, or one of the many disappointments of the New Labour era, where we continued with that whole privatisation agenda and sort of accelerated it in some ways and embraced the private finance initiative. And I think it was done with the best of motives. It was a way of getting investment into the public realm without it appearing on the bottom line, because we were obsessed with, you know, PS, public sector borrowing requirements, and appearing to be fiscally prudent and all that kind of nonsense. But it's left us, it's mortgaged the future. And you know, one of the other great things that John McDonnell announced, I think it was at the conference before last, if I'm not mistaken, or was it this one where he said we'll bring back in those PFI contracts, and that's absolutely the right way to go, I think. And then just on the relation to housing, which is the other area that I was asked to say a few words about. I mean, we have a massive housing crisis, don't we, right across the country. I mentioned in my opening remarks about how working class youngsters like me in the 70s were able to aspire to buy our own home, and although we were quite young in buying a house at 19, it wasn't that unusual, but most people, if they'd not bought in the teens, would have moved out anyway in their sort of early 20s in that era, and if they didn't buy, they'd get a council house, because there was lots of council houses being built at that time, wasn't there? And we've ended up with a situation where the right to buy was introduced by Thatcher when she came in 1979. By the way, that was a Labour policy, in 1959. I don't know if you know that. It was in the Labour Party's manifesto in 1959. But a Labour version of the right to buy, of course, would have been done in a much more sustainable way than it has been with the Conservatives, because houses have flogged off and then we never replaced them, did we? But what we also said, or what they also said, was that the providers of new public housing would be housing associations. But they said, we want you as housing associations to build the public houses, the new public housing, but we're going to cut the social housing grant. But then they said, but don't worry about that, because you can just borrow the money, the difference from the money markets. And don't worry about the extra loan charges, because you can service them through higher rents. And don't worry about your higher rents, because we'll subsidise them through housing benefit. And then you sort of fast forward a few more years to the Housing Act in 1989, I think it was, where they deregulated the private rented sector. And then when Clive Soley challenged George Young in the House of Commons after this had been passed, and said, Clive Soley was our housing spokesperson at the time, Shadow Housing Minister, said, look, rents are going through the roof. The public sector, they're increasing because of the high rents in the housing association sector, because of housing associations are borrowing on the money markets and having to increase the rents to service the loan charges. The deregulated private renter sector had seen rents go through the roof. And so he was saying, look, how are people supposed to afford to pay these rents? And his precise words were, if you look in Hansard, you can see, if people can't afford to pay market rents, housing benefit will take the strain. Well, he's not wrong there, because we've ended up now spending around about 24 or 25 billion pounds a year on subsidising high rents in the country. Around 10 billion of that is going to private landlords, stuffed in the back pocket, nice money if you can get it. And then the remainder, some of that goes for council rents, yes, but a bigger proportion of the remaining 14 or 15 billion is for housing association rents. And if you think about it, therefore, what this Conservative Party has done, this is the party that claims to be the custodians of the public purse, by the way, is to use housing benefit, public money, to enrich private landlords and to generate bankers' bonuses. Now that's an absolute scandal, isn't it? But where is the media actually highlighting this scandal? And frankly, where were we when we were in government? Because we continued with that model in those 13 years. That's the sadness. We continued with that model, and we should have regulated the private rented sector, and we should have started building council houses again, but we never did that. And we had a curious policy of rent convergence as well during our period in office, where we said that council rents had to rise at RPI plus a few more percentage points, and housing associations could only increase their rents at RPI, with the idea to being that council rents and housing association rents would equalise over time. And to me, I take a fairly simplistic view, a bit like the Claycross rent rebels all those years ago, who were advocates of municipal socialism, and they refused to implement the Rent Act, didn't they? Ted Heath it was actually, trying to force them to increase their rents, because they took a fairly straightforward view that you should keep rents in the public sector. Public rents should be low, so that people on low incomes can have the dignity of being able to pay their own way. I mean, part of the problem with means-tested benefits is that, because the way they've been stigmatised, is that often people don't claim them. They feel too ashamed to claim them. It's an absolute scandal that is what is happening. But that, I'm afraid, is the case. And I was looking at something the other day where they reckon 30%
I think it was the UN special rapporteur was saying when in his investigation, they're saying there's 1.5 million in extreme poverty in the nation that is the 6th biggest economy in the world, that around 30% of universal credit applicants give up. They don't complete their application. This is an utter scandal that's going on, and again, regrettably, the media hasn't done its job in actually, highlighting that. But we've got an opportunity now, haven't we, to put forward a programme that is really resonating with people. This manifesto here, is one that really did resonate with people. I described it as the best manifesto since 1945. That was a bit of hyperbole, because I think there's been some more radical propositions than this one. But this was a manifesto which did resonate, I think, with people. There was such a massive appetite for a socialist alternative, for a progressive alternative to what we'd had for the last, nearly 4 decades, to be fair. And we're in the 5th print run, with this, by the way. And I've been in the party for 42 years, and I've campaigned in every single local and national election since that time. And I've never known people to talk about the manifesto on the doorstep. I don't know whether you've found that, but people couldn't get enough of it. Really, it's incredible. It's not exactly a bestseller, but it's not far short of that, and that's just fantastic. But look, the next manifesto will be bolder, will be more radical. And this is where again the members can have a major role, I think, in helping to create the space to deliver that. I just think that, as I say, the support for the sort of alternative that we're putting forward now is overwhelming, and so, as I say, it's very easy now to campaign for the Labour Party. But it was Ed Miliband who said that if we had listened to our members when we were in government between 1997 and 2010, we wouldn't have made as many mistakes. And he's absolutely right in that statement. Because if you think about it, if we'd listened to members, there'd have been no war in Iraq. There'd have been no tuition fees, would there? There'd have been no privatisation of the NHS, because it was Labour that brought in private healthcare. That we wouldn't have put benefits to the poorest people in society. We wouldn't have deregulated further deregulated the money markets as we did. We'd have had a council house building programme. So, one of the things that I was hoping would come through the democracy review was the proposal that was contained in it to give members a greater opportunity to have an influence over the direction of travel of the party. We could embrace digital democracy, use this new technology to give all members an opportunity to have a say over policy. But regrettably, the outgoing NEC, or the NEC that signed off on the democracy review, kiboshed quite a lot of the ideas that were coming through, and that was one of them. And so I think that we need to revisit that, because if we can put members in the driving seat, not only will we, I think, get better policy, we will ensure that we have a better chance of winning the next election, and we will be in a better place to stay in power when we get there, because there'll be huge pressure put on the party when we win. We're already seeing it now with the smears and the attacks that we're being subjected to. But that's because we're going to shake up the status quo. I mean, again, Ed used to always say when he was leader, the thing that used to upset him most of all, you may have heard him say this, was when people said, "You're all the same." And I used to think, well, Ed, you're the leader, kind of come forward with a more radical proposal in terms of our policy going forward. And we had to fight tooth and nail just to get a commitment to say that we will abolish the bedroom tax. And so obviously it was a better proposition than what the Tories are putting forward, but a lot of people, and I lost my seat on the basis of that, really felt that there wasn't sufficient difference between what we were putting forward and what the Tories were putting forward. And a lot of people didn't vote, a lot of people ended up voting UKIP, and a lot of people voted for the Green Party. Across the country in 2015, the 15.6 million didn't vote. Nearly 4 million voted for UKIP, and 1.5 million voted for the Greens. They were the biggest cohort, the non-voters. in that election by a big distance, around 11.5 million, I think it was, the Tories achieved, and that's what gave them an overall majority. And in my own constituency in 2015, the Tories won with 16,500. We were just 41 votes behind them, but the non-voters were 25,000. And so there's a big job for us, I think, to do in actually reaching out to those non-voters and appealing to people, and finding a way of doing politics with people, not to people. You know, we can't be just, it can't be just about going and knocking on doors. That's really important, but we've got to be getting much more embedded in the community, and so that people feel that, you know, the Labour Party is part of the community and that we're on their side. And, you know, there is, as I say, overwhelming support for our policy programme going forward. So in that sense, we're in a good place. But still, even at the last election, although we did up our votes substantially, we got 2 million more votes than we'd, or 2 million votes from people who didn't normally vote, should I say. We got the biggest increase in vote share since 1945, but we didn't just quite get over the line. But when you think about the run into that election, I mean, you couldn't have had a worse running, could you? I mean, with you know, with the coup and the attacks that the leadership were being put under by our own side, to actually have achieved what we did was absolutely remarkable. And I think had that campaign gone on another week or so, we would have, you know, we'd have probably seen Jeremy in number 10, to be honest with you. So I think we've got every chance of winning the next election. Bearing in mind we went into the last one 25 points behind, and then we ended up with the biggest vote share, as I say, since 1945. If we can go into the next election, you know, even Stevens or a bit ahead, I'd like to be. I mean, crikey me, we could be sweeping the board. And given the Brexit mess that the Tories are in at the moment, you know, there's every possibility of an early election, and you know, we need to seize the moment whenever the election comes. But I think that democratisation is so important. And it was Tony Benn, again, I quote him quite a bit actually, who said that democracy is the most revolutionary thing in the world. And you know, whenever grassroots party members, whenever, you know, ordinary members of the public get a bit of power, there's a reaction to try and quell that, and to try and, you know, put people back in their box, as it were. We saw it 200 years ago, the Peterloo massacre, or we'll be commemorating the 200th anniversary of that. That were people then, you know, demanding the right to vote, demanding a better share of the nation's wealth, etc., and the establishment ruthlessly put them down. And the aftermath of that, of course, is there's a film. Have people seen the film Peterloo? It's not a bad film. It's a bit too long, in my opinion. I think they could have done a better job of it. It's well worth a watch, anyway. But they banned mass meetings, but they also placed restrictions on the distribution of newsletters. The information is power, in it, you know, and they put punitive taxes on those pamphleteers that were distributing information to kind of working class communities. Well, a similar sort of thing is happening today with the restrictions that they want to bring into the social media. What was brilliant, I think, about the last campaign, and why it was very different, I think, to what happened when Tony Benn was in his pomp in the early 1980s, and in the run into that 1983 general election where we got wiped out. Obviously the SDP didn't help there. Was that the media were able to get away with this complete demonisation and misrepresentation, and there's no real means of responding or challenging that back, other than, you know, meetings like this and talking to people face to face, and distributing leaflets through people's doors. Now, of course, we're able to reach out to millions of people. It's incredible. I mean, those Momentum videos, for example, we're getting 12, 13, 14, 15 million views. Incredible, far more than what the Daily Mail and the Sun and the rest of it were achieving. And so they were incredibly depressed about the whole situation, that they weren't able to control it, you know. And it felt a bit like the scene, people seen a very British coup where the media, there's like a left-wing government comes to power, and the media have been doing their best to demonise them, but they come to power against all the odds, and they just can't believe how this has happened. Well, I think in a similar sort of way, although the Tories, as we know, did just manage to get over the line. But that mass movement that we now have at our disposal, the access to social media, a programme of common sense socialist policies which are, you know, hugely popular with the public. Do people see Giles Brandreth looking for secret socialists in Guildford?
Yeah.
Has everybody seen that?
Yeah.
It's well, he goes round and he's got this clipboard like this here, and he's got a series. Oh, it's not a clipboard, but you can just imagine it's a clipboard. And he's got about half a dozen policies on there, like about tuition fees, I think, and railways, bring the railways back to public ownership, housing programme, kicking the privateers out of the NHS, etc. And asking people, they say, "Excuse me, sir, they go through, do you support these?" And they go, "Oh, yes, that's a very great idea. Yes, I really do. Yeah. And tuition fees, very sensible. Bring the railways back. Yes, about time too. The railways are very terrible." And then saying, stop a woman, men and women, and right the way, no difference gender-wise, they were all kind of really supportive. And then he was saying, "Well, you're a secret socialist then, madam." And then saying, so they were kind of going, "What do you mean by that?" And they said, "Well, these are the policies of Jeremy Corbyn." And then he turned it round, there's a big picture of Jeremy on it. And they kind of stepped back in horror, But of course, Jeremy had been demonised during that time, hadn't he? And in the election campaign, of course, we had this fantastic mass movement, we had the social media campaign, which was brilliant, but people were also able to see Jeremy on the mainstream media. And they actually then recognised that he didn't have two horns and a tail. He was actually quite a decent geezer and spoke a lot of common sense. And that's clearly, I think, what is absolutely on our side. And I think, with the sort of policies that we're putting forward, with the notion that we need to democratise our economy, because that is absolutely key, I think, embracing, as I was saying earlier, the technological revolution, we can actually create a situation where we have a good society, where we can reduce the working week, where we can pay the pensions to people, where we can even bring about Tony Benn's idea of increasing the school leaving age to 75, as he once said. But you may not know, though, that he then received a letter from a disgruntled 85-year-old who said to him, "Dear Mr. Benn, why are you discriminating against me? I've just graduated from the Open University, and according to you, I shouldn't be entitled to do that." So he said, "I've changed my position. There should be no upper age limit on lifelong learning." Well, we can kind of absolutely, yes, that deserves a round of applause, I think. Yeah, it does. But that's the kind of prize that we are fighting for, I think. And so, winning this election is absolutely key. I think there's got a great opportunity of winning in places like Weymouth here. What's the constituency name? Is it just Weymouth? Is
South Dorset.
What's it called?
South Dorset.
Oh, South Dorset is it? What was the majority here then?
When Jim Knight was the MP,
Yeah.
which was before 2010.
Yeah.
What was it?
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, that's an easy. Bearing in mind, we've got all these secret socialists all over the place, so we should be able to win them over. I mean, one of the things that I'd be interested in your take on this is just in relation to democracy, is that we, in my opinion, should embrace electoral reform as well. I think, and
yes.
I would like to see not just a pure list system. I used to be a big advocate of first past the post. I thought that was the best way to go. But I think that if we could have a hybrid system, similar to what I think they've got in Scotland, where you have bigger constituencies, but it enables you to keep a constituency link in that sense, and then you have a top-up system, people elected off a list. That then gives an incentive, I think, to activists, to Labour supporters all over the country, even the safest Tory seat, to maximise the Labour vote, because that will then maximise or increase the number of people that we can get off the list, off the top-up list. And I think that would be a way of bringing more people in to the political sphere and to encourage people to participate in the democratic process. So with democratising our party, to give people greater opportunity to influence the direction of travel of the party, greater power over the selection of candidates, greater power over the local council as well. There's an idea that we should elect the Labour group leaders in local authorities, and that we should once again give the power to members to draw up the local manifesto as well, rather than it being the preserve of the Labour group. All of those things together with democratising our economy, creating more worker cooperatives, not embracing public ownership of the model that was introduced in 1945, which is very much a top-down one, but this would be very much of a bottom-up approach. So municipalisation and, as I've said, cooperatives would be the rule of thumb. Because when the Tories came in 1979 with this notion of a property-owning, shareholding democracy, that was quite seductive, and a lot of people, I think, did buy into that. And when we would argue, we already owned the gas and the electricity, the water, people didn't really feel like they owned it. because it was just remote bureaucrats that were running it, and they didn't feel any connection with it whatsoever. So we must not make that mistake again. And one of the most radical proposals in this manifesto was the right to own, so that any company that is subject to asset stripping by a hedge fund or offshoring jobs to low-wage economies, which we've seen loads of jobs go that way, will no longer be able to do that, because the workers will be given the first right of refusal to buy out that company and create a worker cooperative. And it won't just be a theoretical right, it will be a right underpinned by the National Investment Bank and an agency to do to help the workforce do the necessary legals and the financials, etc. So these are quite radical proposals. And what we're talking about is an irreversible, and the emphasis being on irreversible, shift in the balance of wealth and power in our country. That is a massive prize, and I always say to people that we should be inspired by that great protest song that the civil rights campaigners was used as their anthem in the 1950s and 60s in the deep south of the United States, when they were campaigning to get people to register to vote and the rest of it, and for civil rights. And it was keep your eyes on the prize. And we need to keep our eyes on the prize. So it's not just about winning the next election, it's literally about changing the course of history. So you're not just ordinary Labour Party members here today, you are history makers, comrades. I don't want to kind of put the burden too much on your shoulders, but you are going to be in the process of changing the course of history. And as Tony Benn said, keep quoting Tony Benn, don't I? Sorry about that. He was a great man though. Yeah. There are two flames that burn in the human heart, the flame of anger against injustice, and the flame of hope that we can build a better world. And our job, I think, is to inject that sense of hope, that sense that, another world is possible. Another world is possible. It's within touching distance. And we, together, can actually make that happen. And the final quote I just want to finish with is the one from the Shawshank Redemption, which I often trot out, which people may or may not have seen, where Andy Dufresne, he gets thrown into solitary confinement after he's in the office, he's in the governor's office, and he locks the door and he plays this beautiful opera music and he puts it over the tannoy, and there's all the convicts in the square in the exercise yard, and they're all like carried away into a different plane with this beautiful music in this horrible barren environment that they're in. Anyway, he gets severely punished for his troubles, and when he comes out of solitary confinement, he goes into the mess room and he's having dinner with his fellow inmates, and they say, "What was all that about, Andy?" And they have a bit of a dialogue, and in the end he sort of says, "Well, it's about hope. It's about giving people hope." And then Red Redding says to Andy, "Hope is a very dangerous thing in this place." They said, "Hope could drive a man insane in a place like this." And Andy's response is, "No, Red. Hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies." And thanks to Jeremy and John and Diane and a few others, that flame of socialism didn't die inside the Parliamentary Labour Party. They kept it alive and managed to rekindle the flames when he put his name forward onto the ballot paper, and it's grown into this huge bonfire now, and there's massive support for it here and around the world. And just to add a little bit more pressure onto your shoulders, the eyes of the world are really upon us. And I think there's a real chance for us to see a sea change throughout the world, just as what happened when Thatcher and Reagan came to power. And given that there is now in the States, I know we've got Trump there at the moment, but there is huge support for a socialist alternative. And I think we really can change the course of history, change the world. And together, comrades, we can achieve that. So what I would say to you is, my message is to let's go out, win the election, let's go out and make history together. Thank you for listening.